All right, now we're live.
All right, bet. Oh, should I do the introduction?
I think that's a yes.
All right, bet. So here we got popular TikToker Benjamin Politics. We got anarcho-capitalist Spectrify. We got MrCummunist, debunker of the ECP, and we got MattMconnolly, uh, also a popular TikToker. So let's get this started. Each one of you, do both of you have your like opening statements prepared, or do you have opening statements?
I have one prepped.
Yeah, I'll give y'all both like 5 minutes, like max, each to do y'all's opening statements, and after that, you guys just go to a free discussion.
Okay.
Do you want to go first or should I?
You go first.
So today we're here to discuss capitalism and socialism from an economical perspective. I would like to preface this with a few points. Firstly, the distinction between the descriptive analysis of Marxism and the distinction between that and socialism, the distinction between the inevitability of socialism and whether or not we ought to have socialism as an economic system. For example, the predictive capacity of the LTV is a descriptive proposition, but the claim we ought to have socialism is a prescriptive one. We will be dealing with both today, and I want to make sure whether or not it's value-free is made clear when describing these points. Next, I'd just like to outline a few topics of discussion to maintain the flow of the debate. That way it isn't like I don't know. Just the LTV, the predictive capacities of the LTV, exploitation theory, surplus value, the calculation problem, and the Coxodian arguments against it. That's all. Actually, wait, I think I... Oh, yeah. Please note that we do not need to cover all of these, nor exclusively these, and these are just some potential topics of discussion. Lastly, I wish you both good luck, and I hope to have a productive debate, and that this brings us closer to the truth.
All right, you said 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes max.
Okay. All right. So, Marx said that every human society, what every human society has in common is that they take the raw materials that nature gives them and they create the basic necessities of life. So food, shelter, water, clothing. This process where we change the materials that nature gives us, he called production. The first human societies that existed were anarcho-communist societies or hunter-gatherer societies where property wasn't seen as a commodity, but rather it was taken either in common or it was the fruits of what the land provided was taken in common. If we fast forward, at least in Europe, we see the rise of the Greek and Roman empires. They had production based off a slave system where the slaves worked the land and the patricians owned the land. Fast forward a few more years and we see the rise of feudalism, where the feudal serfs worked their land of the feudal lords for a few days and then they worked to sustain themselves. And then fast forward a few years at the turn of the 19th century, we see the rise of capitalism, a system where the proletariat works in the factories and industries while the capitalist owns those factories and industries. So two things emerge. First, we see a group of people, a working class and an owning class. And Marx said that whoever owns production will have the most power in society. So if we look at capitalism specifically, capitalism is based on the basic element of a capitalist system is the commodity. A commodity has a use value, or its ability to satisfy a human want or need, and an exchange value. The exchange value, Marx said, is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time, as I'm sure we all know. And he said that, for example, let's say I have two commodities, like some iron and some wool, and they're both equal to $20. Since I'm saying they're equal to each other, that means that there must be a third quantity that is not iron or not wool, that is in both. And Marx said that they share the quality, that they're both products of labor, and it is labor time which determines exchange value. It's important to note that Marx's value theory, he never called it the labor theory of value. He differentiated it from that of Ricardo and Adam Smith. But in essence, he said that it's specific to capitalism and it's a fetishization of value and of labor that is contained in a commodity. Because of this value theory, Marx said that capitalists base their production off surplus value. In short, workers are always creating products that are worth more than the raw materials and wages that go into them, and this is the source of profit. Because of this, we see a tendency for capitalists to lengthen the working day, to keep their workers working longer hours, to lower wages, to maximize the profits that they can get, to keep an army of unemployed people, so we can have they can have an easily replaceable labor force, and also so that they can tell their workers, hey, you better work hard or else you'll get fired and I can replace you with the next guy. Capitalism creates terrible conditions for the working class, as we've seen in the Gilded Age. And Marx's solution to this was a new form of production called socialism. Capitalism is a system based off private ownership of the means of production, where distribution is based largely on free markets. Socialism is public ownership of the means of production. And we can see that whenever we take steps to democratize the production process, we see the standard of living increase. Matt is going to bring up some examples of the Scandinavian model, where we see social democratic nations where the government takes a role, have better standards of living than capitalist nations. We have also seen that with worker co-ops, they provide better higher rates of worker satisfaction. They have higher profits even, and they also have they are more likely to survive business failures or economic crises. I'm sorry, not business failures. And of course, we can also reference a number of socialist revolutions, like, for example, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. They are able to lower the child mortality rate by 50%. They were also able to increase literacy drastically in their home country. So socialism is a superior system because it allows, instead of basing production off the generation of wealth for a few, we have production based off rational planning and the needs of human society. That's it.
All right, Matt, do you have an opening? Matt or Ben, do you have opening statements, or do you want to go to free discussion?
No, I don't have it.
Yeah,
Alright,
I'm
yeah.
good. I'm good with discussion too.
All right, yeah. So
Uh,
you guys just pick a topic you guys want to discuss, and I'll be pretty hands-on.
I just have one question. So you said you started talking about the reserve of workers in order to easily like replenish the workforce for the capitalists. Wouldn't that be solved by a federal jobs guarantee?
Yeah.
So then wouldn't, like, assuming away all other criticism, like assuming what you said was true, then what would be your opposition to social democracy?
My opposition to social democracy, I have two major points. Social democracy, like current social democracies, can just export their exploitation elsewhere to the global south. Like, I remember reading about how a company based in Denmark still uses child labor in Africa. And also, you're still basing production based off the extraction of surplus value and wealth. So even if you have all these government-funded programs that are funded through taxes, the economy still has to be good in order to fund them through taxes. And the economy is doing well if capitalists are making a profit. So if profits start to fall, capitalists can then try to reinstate their influence over the government and try to go back to revert to a more conservative social order. This happened. I'm going to stop there because I don't want to keep rambling. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with Jonathan there. I think that social democracy would be a lot more preferable in America than what we have right now, or at least an increased social democratic state. I think that if we had ownership over our natural resources, for example, I think that would be great to share in the wealth of our nation for all of our citizens who live here. But I kind of want to echo what Jonathan said as well, is that social democracies kind of leave in place the contradictions of capitalism, and the capitalists are always going to try to gain power over their workers. So the labor movements that happened in Europe and in Scandinavia, that won a lot of different reforms, that won free healthcare, that won free college, that won higher wages. And that was, sometimes it was actually pretty violent, but that happened all across Europe and all across Scandinavia, where workers collectively bargained against their employers to gain more policies that benefited them, essentially. But what we're seeing now is that in Denmark, for example, the government is continuously falling pressure to capitalists to cut these benefits, and to try to privatize them as well, at the behest of workers. And I really have a problem with that, just because leaving the capitalists in power threatens the existence of the workers and their gains.
Yeah, I'd just like to respond to what Jonathan said. I guess your first point in particular. So your substantiation for the first point on imperialism and exporting exploitation to, I think what you said, the global south.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I would think you'd have to prove that to be like an inherency to social democracy. You wouldn't like be able to just point to like a Nordic model or something and say, oh well, it happens here, therefore, because that'd sort of be like a fallacy of composition.
Okay. Um, yeah, I suppose my theoretical basis for that is that you still have a fundamentally capitalist mode of production with private ownership. And whenever you have private ownership, you're going to have capitalists are always going to want to make as much profits as possible. So when they start to pay their workers well, and they start to ask for benefits and pay raises that when we don't see a proportional change in productivity, they will look for ways to maintain their profits. And we can also see this as an example, like with the rise of neoliberalism. Like in the 60s, in the late 60s, there was a really strong leftist movement, and it got so powerful that a bill was proposed in Sweden where they would eventually start giving shares of companies to the workers, so that eventually, like the majority of companies would be publicly owned. It didn't pass, but the capitalist establishment there was so scared that they started funding conservative think tanks, and they started attacking they're successful in attacking like public housing and repealing some regulations. So Sweden still is a far lot better than the U.S., but they still, like, the capitalist movement there was still powerful enough to pull back some stuff.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of add on that as well. Sweden, I'm pretty sure that's where H&M is based. If you got that, the clothing store, and so H&M outsources labor to Bangladesh, where they underpay their workers severely, especially for the labor that they put into it. And you know, you're right that we can't necessarily prove that under social democracy, imperialism is inevitable. And by the way, are you arguing for social democracy, or are you just kind of trying to push back a little?
No, I'm brought up social democracy because the original contentions I saw in the opening statement would lead me to believe that social democracy, or rather that there would be no contentions with social democracy. So I was asking for just further clarification in that regard.
Right, and I just wanted to clarify on that as well. But yeah, like Jonathan said, I just think that leaving the capitalists in place, and we've seen this throughout history, when capitalists are able to use their money and power to lobby governments, which I know you guys are both anti-government, so this might not apply directly to you, but capitalists often use their money and power to lobby governments to overthrow other leaders in other nations, so that these capitalists can keep profiting off of cheap labor and cheap resources.
Yeah, I think I guess with the point you brought up, or I guess the point Jonathan brought up earlier, concerning that his theoretical basis for this for the exporting of exploitation to the global south, I think that could probably be fixed with a tariff, the imposition of tariffs, right? Because if we have them exporting their labor to the global south, but the costs of production go up as you export outside of the country, which would force them to stay inside of the country because they want to make a profit, right? So I think on that basis, right, you could theoretically maintain a social democracy without exporting exploitation to the global south, while maintaining a public sector like an ELR, in which we would have like a minimum, or I guess an implicit minimum wage, because work. So it wouldn't be a formal minimum wage in the sense of what we have in America, 7.25, right? It would be like the employer of the last resort would offer $15. Workers want to make money, so they go to $15 an hour. And if the private sector does not pay more than $15 an hour, no one works in the private sector. And you'd be able to, the jobs would be green jobs, or whatever.
My response to that is, like, it's all like it seems like a lot of work when we're just, like, what we're really fundamentally doing is putting more public control over the production process. Like, if we're having the government step in and we're putting on tariffs, it seems like we're just having more public control, and we should just move towards socialism. And we are still keeping the fundamental aspect of capitalism, where we are we are having a small group of people control the production process. They are raking in the profits, and we have to ask, like, does this make sense? Does it make sense to for us to have, like, billionaires who are making money off the labor of other people. I'd actually like to move on. Can I ask a question for you guys?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is like, what incentive do capitalists have to raise the standard of living for their workers, like raise wages or like lower like the working day without like constant pressure from like unions or worker groups or protests and strikes, because they are incentivized to do the exact opposite.
So I would entirely disagree with that. Now, first of all, I believe workers actually advocating for higher wages and stuff like that is a part of capitalism. You know, I know sometimes those people aren't pro-capitalism, but oftentimes they are. And I don't see how that's in any way contradictory to capitalism. You know, if you have a bunch of workers and you say, hey, we're going to need higher wages because of this and this and this reason, you know, cost of living is going up. I believe that's perfectly compatible. But I still believe there are incentives. And we saw this throughout the 18th century, especially. And yes, absolutely. At times, and especially in specific places, wages did go up and working days did go down, or working hours did go down because of specific movements. But overall, most economists and especially economic historians do agree that the rising wages and falling of the working hours happen naturally because of capitalism and because of generally higher amounts of wealth. And so the incentives come from a few different places. One would be having more consumers, you know, having people who are actually able to spend, because if you don't have people who can spend, then you're not going to sell your products and you're not going to make profits in general. That kind of even goes back to your other point. You know, if we're going out and just hiring a bunch of people for practically nothing, and then back here we have a bunch of unemployed people, we're not selling any products. So that's something to take note of there as well. Also, there's direct links to wages and productivity. Giving higher wages often does increase productivity. Having happier workers increases productivity, increases profits. There's an overwhelming amount of data that backs that up, and capitalists are well aware of this. They have people who they pay big money to go through all of this research and find the most efficient ways to make profits. And so they're well aware of this. Often the problems today in like modern America is, you know, like smaller companies, they can't really afford to raise their wages all the time. And with bigger companies, it kind of gets into, you know, government option, and they'd rather get people to raise the minimum wage, so it hurts competitors, stuff like that. That's one of the reasons we oppose government. But yeah, I would absolutely say there's an inherent incentive there.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
I'd agree with what Ben said. Like I'm just simple. I'm just gonna keep it simple. Like I'm not anti-unions. I think that's compatible with capitalism, so long as they're like not established through some like unjust means. But for the most part, I'm pro-unions. Yeah.
So yeah, about your points. So your first point about not having enough consumers to spend. Oh wait, no, about like the working day being shortened in like the 19th and 18th century. I'd argue that's still because of like class struggle from the workers, right? Because like the 10-hour workday movement that started as early as like the 1820s, at least here in America. Like in 1825, Boston carpenters struck for a 10-hour workday. Moving to the 1830s, like it began to incorporate skilled workers. I still think it's largely due to like the formation of unions and class struggle. And also you said like there's not enough consumers to sell to. I think we can absolutely say that like in the past 4 decades, you know, the Economic Policy Institute study that shows that like wages have been stagnating in comparison to productivity for the bottom 80% of the workforce. And you can justify like paying your workers less and less by switching to a system based off credit, right? Like everybody has credit cards, everybody has credit card debt. We live in a country, the wealthiest nation on earth, but like 40% of the population can't afford a $400 emergency. If you base it off credit, you can sort of like delay, you can sort of keep consumers buying without having to pay them as much. And then this point about productivity, this will be my last point. I think like there's a difference between productivity and profits, because while paying your workers higher wages increases profits, there's research that shows that, paying your workers higher wages increases productivity. There's research that shows it cuts into profit margins. Like a study that was done, a study that was done in the United Kingdom found that okay, I'm gonna find it, but yeah, there's research.
Jonathan, you care if I hop in quick?
I what?
You care if I hop in quick?
Yeah.
While you find that?
Mhm.
I was also just going to say, like, productivity has gone up like significantly over the past 40 years, yet wages haven't stayed with. Wages have basically stagnated since the 1980s, since we adopted, a neoliberal form of government. So, I mean, what do you have to say to that?
Yeah,
I'm just gonna
there's
jump in. Sorry, I'm just gonna jump in real quick.
Yeah, go
We
ahead.
found that like minimum wage increases in Poland led to an 8.5% increase in the average wage, but a 4.5% decrease in firm profitability. So my bad.
Yeah. I mean, minimum wages would be throwing off disequilibrium, so I wouldn't argue with that. In fact, I would entirely agree that problems can happen through higher minimum wages. So it's not just like an inherent thing. Like objectively, if you raise the wages, then every single time you'll have higher profits. Because you still have to worry about market equilibriums. Now, as far as like the EPI thing on productivity and wages, now I don't want to like vehemently defend the status quo, but I will go over a few things, right?
Mhm.
So one of the issues with this is it uses two different deflators, inflation deflators, with both wages and productivity. So that is an issue because the CPI is what they used for wages, and that tends to underestimate inflation. And the other one, I forgot exactly what it's called, that they used for productivity, tends to overestimate it. So you kind of had these automatically going in opposite directions. If you look at like actual specific research, looking at specific productivity ties to wages, then it's always extremely close. It's very like I can actually
Yeah, I have some.
I can
studies on
link
it.
you something right here.
Yeah, please.
I'll put it in the chat.
Mhm.
If I do, I have the private chat on there.
Yeah, I have
Oh, here it is.
I-
Okay, private chat.
I also have some resources concerning wage stagnation.
Because
on
like the
chat.
general graph that people pass around just is. Oh, I was like, I know I didn't put that many links. I suddenly saw like 5 links. All right. Anyways, so that specific graph I disagree with. Also, it looks at like specific lower earning workers, and then it has overall productivity. Also, you have stuff like increased productivity through machines, stuff like that. So I would kind of disagree with that, even though I don't want to vehemently defend the status quo. That's still something that it just happens in markets. Wages and productivity are very closely tied together. Now, as for like the $400 emergency, again, I don't want to I don't want to go and I don't want to act like I'm defending the status quo, but this comes from like a Federal Reserve study that they do every year, a survey, and they ask people, what would you do if you had a $400 emergency? And they have different answers. Most people say they would borrow money from friends, or they would take out loans, stuff like that. Now, this doesn't actually mean, people are going to go into extreme poverty if there's a $400 emergency. Just because you have a $400 emergency and you borrow money doesn't mean you absolutely can't afford it, or you're in an extremely impoverished situation. And so that would be my point to make there. And yeah, I think that about covers it.
We're Spectrify, right?
Yep.
If I call you that. Spec.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to say to that?
Oh no, I just I've written some stuff concerning
Okay.
Wage stagnation, so that's why I had these links already.
Yeah, I think my general point still stands about like what's it, the incentive to like increase, like improve the conditions of your workers, because we have seen that like we have seen that also like unions are absolutely necessary to protect workers, which is also an example of like increasing public ownership. In fact, the earlier research has shown that like one study found that union erosion can explain 1/3 of the growth of wage inequality among men, and 1/5 of the growth of wage inequality among women from 1972 to 2007. And we've lost out on like workers have lost out on 2.1 billion fewer dollars in weekly paychecks for the past like 40 years without unions. And like that's just an example of how like without public ownership, without more control from the workers, capitalists are just going to take in more and more profits. So I think a point still stands that like your boss wants you to work longer hours and wants to pay you less because it's in his best interest. He's going to get more money. So I still want to push back on this question here. Like, what is the incentive?
I think the incentives, I think as we outlined this before, like would be pushed by unions, right? Because we're not opposed to unions. And then there's I guess another point like external of those, just from like just deregulation in general, right? It brings tighter labor markets, and when we and as a consequence of that, right, we have higher wages. And just the sustainment of labor in the market, right? It would have to be there'd be the lowest possible wage in there would have to be a livable wage.
Okay. So can I ask you guys a question? Like I know you guys say that you aren't against workers, but like we've seen like for the past 4 decades, like unions, but we've seen in the past 4 decades, like neoliberals are absolutely against like unions. And we've seen that like Ronald Reagan, for example, the famous air traffic control PATCO strike, I think it was called PATCO, where he fired like 13,000 air traffic controllers who were going on strike. I know you guys aren't like neoliberals, but I'm like curious, like would you support like unions in the workplace? And my question is like, how do you expect like there to be like a peaceful society if you have on one hand the workers fighting for better conditions and the capitalists whose like interests are diametrically opposed?
I don't think that necessarily has to result in violence, right? Like just because like we have different interests, I don't think that like it necessarily falls on that you can't have like like even like civil discourse, like all of us, we have opposing views and opposing interests. We all want to get to a different society, but that doesn't necessarily mean we can't maintain.
Well, even if it's peaceful, even if it's peaceful, like you're still gonna have that conflict. This goes to like Marx. This goes back to what Marx said about class conflict, right? You have the workers on one hand and the capitalists on the other, and they are going to come into conflict because their interests are opposed, and you have to have a resolution. Either you're going to stay with capitalism and the conflict isn't resolved, or you go to socialism and the workers take control and the conflict resolves itself. So I'm still curious about this point. Like,
well, here's a point that I can make in response to that, which I already made a bunch of points about that, which I do believe it's entirely incentivized, and we have an overwhelming amount of evidence for that. But if you were to be at a firm with 100 other workers and they all had their wages lowered by $1 per hour, and all of that money went to you, would that not be more beneficial to you while being detrimental to them? I mean, there's still contradictions within classes, which, I mean, we generally disagree with these Marxist distinctions in classes. But then within capitalists, you have contradictions within capitalists themselves. They have to compete with other capitalists, especially as me and Spec would definitely believe. This would be a lot more so in a free market economy. You know, today we have big places like Amazon, Walmart, places that get billions of dollars in subsidies. We do not like that. You know, we generally don't like most billionaires because most of them take advantage of these things. Apple, Disney, they gain their empires through things like patents, which we're against. So we don't want these people exploiting people through the government to get these massive monopolies or close to monopolies. And because then they don't really have those incentives as much because they don't have much competition. You know, people kind of have to work for them. So once you have a more competitive market, like we've seen in the past, it definitely drives up wages much quicker because there are, in fact, incentives there, not only because of competition. Like, even if that is in a way detrimental to you, like it's not directly increasing profits to increase wages, then you just might not have workers because you're not paying enough.
I mean, there have been multiple industries throughout history, especially like during the Gilded Age, but even today, where companies will they'll collude with each other to try to price fix. And even though price fixing is technically illegal, these companies still do it. So like phone companies do it, oil and gas companies do that. So like, how do you stop that in a free market, a fully free market economy where you've deregulated, you know, almost everything with no government? How do you stop that from happening?
I mean, most examples in the past of price fixing weren't very successful. You had like Jay Gould, for example, who broke up some price fixing situations. The problem with it is most of the time people don't really trust each other, and that's why, like in the UK, they'll actually have people sign legally binding contracts in order to have these sort of price fixing schemes, because they just don't trust each other. Because if one person decides to just lower their price, then they're just going to end up getting more profits than everyone else, and so that is beneficial to them. Again, that's a contradiction within the capitalists. And also, it opens way for new entrepreneurs to come in because you cause disequilibrium. And the role of an entrepreneur is to take advantage of this disequilibrium. And then, they're going to end up gaining most of the market share if they don't end up lowering their prices.
So one thing I want to again push back on. So I was watching a lot of Yaron Brook clips lately. Just kind of preparing for this. I think some of his takes are just interesting to watch, and and try to, but whatever. He even admits that like the Gilded Age was a time where it was like one of the most free markets in America, and with the advent of electricity, Standard Oil kind of took a dive, right? But that took a generation. Like Standard Oil had a monopoly over America for 35 plus years. So like that's a whole workforce that's condemned to working, especially in a lot of areas where there's only one employer, that is Standard Oil, who again is a monopsony. They get to set the price because they're buying these people's labor. That's basically all I had to say, I guess.
Okay, hold on one second. I actually have some stuff on Standard Oil. So,
like you're saying, entrepreneurs will come in, but you're condemning an entire generation to just having to buy from one seller, which is Standard Oil, who is also colluding with the railroad companies, who's also colluding with the banks and JP Morgan. Like they were colluding with each other. How do you protect the workers in this instance?
So in the case of Standard Oil, they substantially decreased the price of oil, which was beneficial to everyone. One of the big things that Rockefeller did is he introduced a new type of barrel, which was cheaper to make, and it brought down oil prices. So that is beneficial to people in general. Now, he didn't have a monopoly for a whole generation during this time, which was about 1870 to 1899. Their market share fluctuated from like 30% to 90%. So they didn't have like a solid monopoly. It fluctuated quite a bit. And then after 1902, it didn't really go over 25% share in the market. So like, and also there's a few things here that I do disagree with, like the railroad companies they were with, those were basically government-backed monopolies. I wouldn't totally say like Rockefeller himself was government-backed in this particular case, but he did collude with people who were like that. But I mean, overall, he did benefit people through those lower prices. And not only that, but he also bought out competitors. And often what people would do is they would start specific companies just so he would buy them out. And then they would just gain more money, and then they would invest their money into other things. They're just taking more of his money, investing in other things, creating new jobs. So I mean, I don't really see anything that was like a negative there. I mean, do you like know of a specific net negative that he caused?
It was just like worker pay, and it was also the fact that workers in some areas, especially where oil was abundant, they only had one choice of an employer. There weren't like that many options for employment. But the other thing is, even if prices are low under a monopoly, that still screws workers in the end. Like Amazon's prices are very low because they have a monopoly over the shipping and internet sales industry. But we've all heard stories that their working conditions are absolutely horrible. Their delivery drivers are having to pee in bottles. There's not well ventilated areas. So just because the consumer benefits from lower prices does not mean that the workers, the people who make up the majority of society, does not mean that they're benefiting from a monopoly.
And just on that example of Amazon, there's a really good famous example. Like Adam Ruins Everything made a video on it about a diaper company where Amazon was lowering the price of diapers that they could buy online to put their top competitor out of business. And it was really cheap for the consumers, but after the old diaper company went out of business, Amazon just rose up the prices again in order to make as much of profit as possible. And we can see that with once capital accumulates, once you have the power to lower prices, so you're not even making a profit, so you can drive out your competitors, you can raise them up again and become the only person who's selling a service. And that's another terrible thing about monopolies.
Yeah, I mean, there's different types of monopolies. There's monopolies of force, the state itself would be a monopoly of force. And then there's monopolies of efficiency. So Rockefeller and Standard Oil, I would say, was a monopoly of efficiency at the times where it technically was a monopoly, which wasn't really that often. But it's because they made things more efficient and they made things cheaper that they were actually able to gain this position. Now with Amazon, like I mentioned earlier, we don't like Amazon. Amazon has gotten billions in subsidies. They get huge tax cuts that other companies don't get, and that makes things very uneven. We like tax cuts, but if you're just focusing on one company, especially a company that already has a lot of power, then that's definitely not any sort of a net positive. So, I don't know about the whole diaper thing specifically, but generally the way markets function is not like that.
I think there's I agree with most of what Ben said, but I think he's taking more of a Misesian route to the formation of monopolies. I think that monopoly that there's just theoretical implications of the formations of monopolies in the market economy, right? So firstly, and this is one of the problems Rothbard outlines in Man, Economy, and State, where he talks about the vertical integration of a firm, right, and the use of economic calculation. So when we have a firm, they can sort of calculate within themselves, so long as they have access to an external market, right? Because they can still, which is what vertical integration is in that context. And then after that, right, he brings us into monopolies by saying, okay, well, if you don't have access to an external market, then there is no mechanism for you to engage in rational economic calculation, right? All your transfers within this area are internal. Therefore, you can't have the exchange ratios for economic calculation, meaning that there's a problem of calculation with the formation of a monopoly, or I guess the maintenance of a monopoly. And then just to go to what Matt was saying, there's also with cartels, because you were talking about how these different companies were, I don't know what the term was, but they were working with one another, which is essentially, I guess, the argument that Rothbard outlines against a cartel would apply here. And that is that they have incentive to turn on one another, right? They have an incentive to stop working with one another and gain the profits for themselves. They have an incentive to leave and then take the profits for themselves. If they're working with one another, right, and they're making money, their incentive is, okay, I'm going to turn on you and I'm going to take the profits. And then just Per Byland, I know he has let me find the article, but he has a great paper concerning the actual size of a firm and how large it can get. So outside of the problem of calculation that was outlined before that, right? There's the theories of competition, which is a whole other thing. I just recommend you just read Chapter 10 of Man, Economy, and State. Rothbard gives his whole outline and critique of neoclassical monopoly theory. And there's a section on it that is concerned with predatory pricing, which also is what you were outlining before with the diaper company. So there's a section on that, and I think that pretty much says everything I want to.
Okay. Matt, you want to respond or? Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that the idea that these companies had an incentive to turn on each other when we're talking about Standard Oil and the railroad company, again, they were colluding in such a way that if
I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to make a quick correction. I didn't say like different companies would turn on each other. Like they're doing entirely different things. I'm talking about specifically price fixing.
No, I was responding to Specs. point.
Oh, okay.
That these companies have an incentive to turn on each other in the Gilded Ages. But these companies had a specific, I guess, agreement that if you stop taking my, basically the whole point was like the railroad was basically just to carry oil, and the oil companies were like threatening this oil company who had like 60% of the market share, like, we will go to your competitors if you don't work with us. You will lose out on all of this money transporting our oil, which makes up a huge percent of your revenue. They had an incentive to work together, not an incentive to turn on each other. That's all I wanted to say.
My point was not concerned with the beginning process, just when the cartel was formed after that.
Gotcha.
Is it okay if like I move on and ask a different question? Okay.
Sure. Do you guys want to talk about the LTV, the calculation problem? I'm not sure what.
I was just going to say, so the debate is over like which system is preferable or better with outcomes. Yeah. So I'm just trying to see. Let's get to that. Why? So I'll throw that to Ben and Spec. Why is your system preferable in the long run? Why should we listen to you guys?
Because I think our system, or I guess a market-based economy, is the one that can engage in rational economic calculation. I guess that'd be the main tenet. I guess there's smaller critiques concerning like the knowledge problem, tacit knowledge, whole other thing.
Can I get in a quick question here? So like I hear, like, I'm sorry if I'm memeing on you guys, but I hear a lot about like libertarians like talking about reason and how like capitalism is like a rational system. But I feel like it's like the opposite. Like Marx said, like one of the biggest contradictions in capitalism is like socialized production, but anarchy of the market, right? We have, like, take Amazon, for example. It is like one of the greatest feats of human infrastructure and like centralized planning ever. Like you have centralized delivery centers and like warehouses. You have thousands of workers, like deliverers, truck drivers. You have software developers making sure the website runs fine. Like everything is planned to a T. And like it's a great, like the service should exist. It's amazing. And like Marx saw that in like the production process in manufacturing industries. But when it comes to distribution, it's just every man for himself, right? Like we saw with the pandemic, like I remember back in the beginning, like now we can get hand sanitizers and masks like it's nothing. But like in the beginning, there was like a scare almost where like it was everybody had to like get masks, and like there was bulk buying of hand sanitizer and masks, and like there wasn't enough to go around. And like you'd hear stories about like families, like people couldn't go outside, like people were buying like 20 rolls of toilet paper while some people had none. And like, yeah, so like it seems to me that we should have a centralized process. We should take the same central planning that we have within the production process and make that more generalized. And also like the distribution and exchange process too, so that like we centralize planning based off need rather than like the generation of wealth. So my question is, yeah.
So I think there's a couple problems with that. I guess I'll just run through the points one by one. So with your point on COVID, I think that like is actually proves my point, because as you said, like you prefaced this, I think you sort of skipped over this, that now you can buy like it's nothing. The market adjusted to consumers' demands, right? And then with your point on Amazon like centrally planning their things, this actually goes back to what I said before with the vertical integration of the market, right? The only way Amazon can do this is by virtue of the marketplace economy, right? The only way they can engage in rational economic calculation in the production process is by virtue of the fact that we have an external market. And then your next point was concerning what?
I think. I said like we should take that same centralized planning within the production process and make it so like we have centralized planning of production, distribution, and exchange.
Yeah. So if you have all internal exchanges within a market, within like just the state, I'm assuming.
Sorry, I should have said just like production and distribution, not exchange.
Well, I mean, it would just be transfers, but I mean, exchanges or distribution, production, they all work in this context, right? as long as these things are all internal, you don't have an external market to resort to, right? You're not going to have a mechanism in order for you to engage in economic calculation. You still need something you still need it, right? The original Misesian argument, right? The first premise he begins with is the fact that all your exchanges or all your transfers or whatever you want to call them are internal, right? And then the exchange ratios, that I already outlined that argument. But my question to you is, how are you going to engage in rational economic calculation? And if you're going to present Cockshot's arguments, just refer to the paper and I'll provide my response.
Well, we can tell from the name you don't really like Cockshot.
I do
but
not.
I was going to ask. No, that's fun. That's funny. I did enjoy that. But when you guys keep saying rational economic planning, and I just want to know like what you mean by rational, because to me, rational economic planning basically just takes like a market, and we all know how like if there's an industry where profits are really high, firms will enter the new market, right? And if profits are really low, or if there's even losses, firms will exit, right? So the rational economic planning just seems to go to the places where like the profits are really high, but not necessarily geared towards like human needs. You know, like there's a shit ton of commodities where they're not based around human needs, which is what me and Jonathan are arguing, but based around like stupid stuff. So
yeah, so I think that in terms of rational, all we're talking about is in the context of ordinal preferences, unless you're going to conceptualize of utility as a simple cardinal unit, which is a whole other discussion we could have. But just in the context of this, we're talking about consumers' ordinal preferences. And then for your point on consumers' needs, right, the calculation problem, that's one of the presuppositions it makes, right? Like, and I was actually talking to someone about this earlier because they were DMing me some of their contentions with the calculation problem. The calculation problem isn't concerned with your ability to know what people's like needs are, right? So like I know you need like food, housing, whatever, right? But that's not what we're concerned with, right? That's not what the calculation problem is indeed critiquing, or rather your lack of ability to do, right? And then your next point was the profit and loss, right? Yeah, so the profit and loss mechanism, and I think I know Mises has a whole book on it. It's like 50 pages, pretty sure you get through it, and then there's a section in MES, I believe the beginning of chapter 3, subsection 1 should be called profit and loss, where he just talks about how the origination, right, the role of profit and loss in the market economy is to show the over and under capitalization in the market, and entrepreneurs go to fix this over and under capitalization, right? And if there's an under capitalization, right, and they succeed in like capitalizing on that area, right, it brings us closer towards equilibrium. And the post-Keynesians are all going to get mad at me, and this is like the whole general tendency towards equilibrium thing. But the undercapitalization area, right, is going to be if the entrepreneur capitalizes on this area, they're going to make a profit. If it's an overcapitalized area, they're going to make a loss, right? And in order for you to deem this as like irrational, right, is to disregard like all of what consumers desire. It's for you to call what consumers want irrational, and I don't think you can really make a case for that. That's all.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, can I make a few points? Kind of going back a little bit. So John was talking about like Amazon, and I guess he's sort of referring to Republic of Walmart and kind of the arguments put forward in that book. One of the issues is it kind of conflates economic planning and planned economy, and then even kind of like mixes the two terms up. So they're in two entirely different things. So economic planning is the process by which like various participants in the economy would make calculations about the economic steps of the future. And then a planned economy is a centralized system where the allocation of everything, raw materials, capital goods, consumer goods, they're implemented by a central authority without a market mechanism. So it is two entirely different things. Amazon isn't centrally planned. It just has economic planning, which is completely normal within capitalism. And then like Spec said, the whole like COVID thing, it kind of showed how the market adjusts. It wasn't too long before we saw, Ford producing ventilators, Tesla producing ventilators, MyPillow producing masks, lots of other people producing masks, distilleries started making hand sanitizer, and much of this stuff was donated even because like, again, there is an incentive for the more well-off in society to take care of everyone else because, an economy, what it is it's a bunch of people working together. If you're letting everyone else fail, then you are going to fail too. Everyone can't. You can't be the one person succeeding and everyone else failing. You're going to fail with everyone else, and that's one of the incentives for people to take care of each other so much. And we saw that a lot during the pandemic. Like a great example is my own bank called me up and they're like, hey, if you can't make this insurance payment this month, just let us know. Please let us know. We'll help you out. Anything like that. There's Facebook was giving away grants to small businesses, and even in the cases where it's not technically directly benefiting you, it could benefit you through emotions, just knowing you're helping people, because people still have emotions.
Not all incentives are monetarily driven.
Can I just jump in?
And then PR, stuff like that. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. First, Spec, I'd love to read this, but is the chat going to be saved after the?
Oh, this is from a book, so you can just, this is like a quote from that Rothbard talks about it. I'll find you the page.
The chat will be saved, and if it's not, I'll copy everything into a doc just to make sure.
Okay, I just wanted to say, for my example with Amazon, I wasn't saying Amazon was socialist or anything. I was just more bringing up the point that this is a contradiction that Marx explicitly states that we have intense planning within businesses. So that it maximizes efficiency, right? With the assembly line is a great example that Henry Ford made, where each worker has a step in the production process. But we have anarchy in the market where production is wild. It's only based off profit, and sometimes we have too much, sometimes we have too little, and it gets distributed unevenly. That was my general point. Also, Matt, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I just had something to respond to Spec and Ben. So. I'm not the biggest defender of the USSR. I think it was an interesting socialist experiment. And I want to point to their economic planning. So one of my biggest critiques with their economic planning was the fact that they didn't plan for commodities. So they had 10,000 pieces of industry, tools of industry that they planned for out of, millions of things within the economy. And they did produce those very well. They planned this with linear programming on pen and paper, and they planned basically which factories were best at producing which goods and how fast they were able to do it. And they were able to quite well maximize these products and produce these products as efficiently as possible within the Soviet Union. My biggest thing is the fact that they didn't focus more on the commodity side of things, but they even expanded it with very early computers where they did plan their economy up to 60,000 products, I believe, which again, it was in the industrial side. It wasn't the best, but that was in the 1970s. So
so there's a couple problems with that just before Ben goes on. Okay. So with the USSR, there's firstly with a relative scarcity indicator, i.e. prices, right? This is actually applicable to what I was saying before with Walmart, right? They have access to an external market, i.e. the rest of the world, right? There's still a global market. And even then, there's other countries have their own markets, and you can still use those for bookkeeping in order to use that as a baseline. But obviously, relative scarcity in both of these areas aren't the same, so there still is a mismatch, right? But they wouldn't be totally groping in the dark, right? So there wouldn't be an impossibility in that regards. But this would only prove the point that in order for socialism to function, or I don't care what you call it in the USSR, in order for that to function, right, it requires an external market, i.e. the US, whatever countries, right? So outside of that point, right? And then with my point that relative scarcity in the relative scarcities in these two areas weren't perfectly the same. Obviously, we can see the productive inefficiencies in the USSR. I don't know if Ben wants to link them. I can link them. I can send them right now, actually. But outside of just the productive inefficiencies. So yeah. Though there's still productive inefficiencies with the USSR, and even then, the economic calculation was still flawed.
Irrational planning within them, irrational pricing within them.
Equilibrium
would be perfectly on the ball. Which
no. It's not that we're not that. It's not that we're in a state of equilibrium. In fact, I'd argue directly to the contrary, right? We're not in an evenly rotating economy. That's just a tool of analysis. It's not actually something that can be reasonably attained, right? But the point is, we're not saying our prices are perfect, right? We're saying our prices are the metric that gets us closest to this, right? And then just for your point on like a computer 60,000 goods, I know Lucas Engelhardt has a paper, and I'll pull up the notes for you right now because I have some stuff on it. In his paper called Central Planning's Computation Problem, essentially what he says, right, is assuming away the calculation problem, assuming away the knowledge problem. Let's assume these both have been solved. There's still a certain computation problem, right? And this is a problem of magnitude. And he says, I know he has three results, or three scenarios, right? So in the population of the U.S. with, let's say, we only have 100 goods, this would take us about 2.6 million years in order to compute this using top 500 or top 50, top 500 supercomputers. And then the global economy, it's even worse. It's like 10.2 quintillion years, or 10.5 quintillion years. And then
can I get in after this?
I think that's all my points. Yeah, so go ahead.
Okay, so yeah. Obviously, like I'm pretty sure you guys know, I'm a cockshot fanboy, I guess. So I prescribe to the idea that like in like a perfect communist or socialist world, instead of prices, you could have a calculation based off labor time. And you can read this in he develops this most in his paper called like
Calculation, Complexity, Economic Planning.
Yeah, the Socialist Calculation Debate Revisited, I think.
Do you know the year?
I'll try to find the year.
I think that's the 93 paper.
Shoot.
I'm not sure if that's a paper in of itself. That's more of like I believe he entitled a video that, and also he has like a slideshow. I'm not sure if that's a particular.
Oh no,
paper.
I don't think
It
I think I'm pretty sure like this was published in like a journal.
Okay, 100%.
Okay,
sure.
well I'm searching for the link. I'll just explain it again. Basically, he says that you can calculate, like, instead of prices, you can look at how much labor is necessary for the production of the product. It's like indirect labor, which are contained in the means of production, and also direct labor, so just like hours worked. Okay, it's called Calculation, Complexity, and Planning. I think you said that?
Yeah, that's a 1993 paper. Yeah. There's Cosma Chalizia has already outlined the arguments concerning it, right?
Okay,
so
can I finish?
Was there? My apologies. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're good. So like also like this is really interesting. I was reading his book Towards a New Socialism. He said that like one of the points he made that's like since the Romans, they had the invention of the water wheel, but that since they had a slaves system, there was no incentivized to like decrease the amount of labor spent on production. So they never had like their own industrial revolution. That's not really part of the debate. I just found that was interesting. Anyway, instead of like basically we could just base production off of labor time, which would be good because we would be like always incentivizing to decrease the amount of work done on products, which is basically what is most essential, the amount of labor. He gives an example in Towards a New Socialism about how in the 50s, IBM was developing highly automated machinery, and in 1965, they opened a new production line in Japan when they already had machinery to do so, just because the laborers in Japan were cheaper because they were getting sweatshop wages. So there was a process that used less labor, but they decided to use like people in Japan because it cost less. So essentially, you can calculate. I'm just going to touch on your point about computer calculation. Cockshot says like that you can calculate the value of every good in like the Soviet Union with like 100 million commodities in like the span of half an hour, I think, because
17 minutes.
Yeah, like TLDR, you can like instead of like setting up prices as like a matrix, or setting up the input-output table as a matrix, you can set it up as like a series of vectors and use a recursive method, and that is faster.
So there's a couple problems with this, and the arguments have already been outlined by Cosmo Chalizia. And I think Mustafa has some stuff regarding it too, but essentially, right, Cockshot underestimates the amount of variables in the economy, right? Just to address the 17-minute argument. The actual, whatever it's called, so he doesn't index by time and space, right? He doesn't tell us, he disregards the where and when. So he drastically disregards the actual amount of variables needed that would be needed to be computed, right? And then there's that's just the smaller critique of magnitude. The larger and I think more important critique is the linearities, right? Because he assumes that these production functions are entirely linear, right? And I think he has a section, Cosmo has a section concerning non-linearities and non-convexities, and he talked about the fixed cost, competition. He talks about linear programming, right? And or I guess the practical value of it, and how there's a gap between this mathematical model and the realities of a complex economy. So there's the drastic underestimation of variables from on Cockshot's end. So the 17 minutes doesn't really work. It's in reality, I think it's like 1,000 years. And then even then, the Lucas Engelhardt paper that I was talking about before, they have it makes 4 key assumptions, right? The 17 minutes. That utility can be compared interpersonally, that it has a simple cardinal functional representation, that a computer with perfect and it has perfect information, i.e., knowledge problem, and that and it assumes away the objections posed by Murphy's 2006 paper, and then so the structure of this, right? He has assumptions, realities, results, right? And then he has some extra notes, but we're not going to touch that right now. His section dedicated to reality, right? Touchstones with reality, he calls it. Touchstone 1, preferences are heterogeneous. Touchstone 2, consumer goods are heterogeneous. Touchstone 3, the current limits on processing power. And this paper actually comes about 20 years after Cockshot's paper, so the limits on processing power would be much more updated. And then once we have these touchstones with reality, we have our results, like the population with the U.S. with a few goods, and then the global economy with many goods, i.e. 6 billion people and 80,000 different consumer goods, which is what the CPI says in the U.S., which is how he gets his number. There'd be about 480 trillion equations you'd need to solve. And then to solve these equations, it would take top 500 supercomputers 10.5 quintillion years, when the Big Bang only happened about 14 billion years ago. So if a computer started the computation at the point of the Big Bang, it would be approximately 0.000000013% of the way done with the calculation.
Can I get a question in?
Yeah.
I think I just have one question. So you mentioned like utility and also like interpersonal utility, and also like I think you said like a computer can calculate that. Is that correct?
I said one of the assumptions made is that utility can be compared interpersonally. Yeah.
Okay. Can you elaborate on that? Just so
yeah, sure. He has a section dedicated. So basically, if the computer is going to determine the distribution of scarce resources in a production process, utility must be interpersonally comparable, as resources can be distributed among people in a number of possible ways. So for a computer to determine whether a particular resource should go to person A or person B requires an interpersonal comparison of utility, i.e. the utility person A would get from X good and person B would get from X good.
All right. I think we're getting away from like the key part of the debate. So after that, I think I'm gonna like.
Soon do you guys want to move on to
but also
ethics?
You
Yeah,
might. I don't. Were we planning to
ethics?
talk about ethics?
I don't know. I want to get back on like what is the better system. I feel like we've gotten away from that. I
yeah.
do want to address some of Spec's points there, but I feel like I want to get
Could
back.
I real
to,
quick?
Yeah, sure. Go
Could I
ahead.
real quick go back to
it.
Matt, because Matt asked some questions and made some points on the Soviet Union, and I do like pretty much most of the research I do on anything is on the Soviet Union, because I think it's like really interesting.
Can I just say one more thing?
Go ahead.
Like I'll be really quick. So like Spec, to your point, like I feel like the point about utility is more so like calculating like how much we should produce, and like the point about Cockshot study is just like you have an objective metric for value. If you're talking about how much you could produce, that goes into a debate about like what Matt was talking about, rational allocation of resources.
Oh, I think that the studies are the empirical studies. Those are contentious. I think you've already seen it, but I think Mustafa has already outlined the criticisms with that paper.
Yeah.
With Kleiman's response to it. I believe it's Kleiman. But
Yeah,
I think A, those studies are contentious, and then B, I had the whole critiques with he assumes production functions are entirely linear, and then he doesn't index by time and space, so his results and his model are necessarily flawed and can't be used to critique the calculation problem.
Well,
Okay,
to say
my
that,
bad, Ben.
to say that like central planning and linear programming doesn't like solve for at least some of that. So I'm from the Midwest, where like farming is like a big deal, right? And farmers all across the Midwest use linear programming to figure out like what crops to farm, when to farm them, what will get you the most value, etc. And this is done across millions of acres of land within the Midwest. And so the idea that it would take a supercomputer, 14 trillion years, whatever you said, is kind of ridiculous to me. And I will be honest with that. Like,
Yeah, so
a smartphone is good at planning.
I was
like,
sorry.
a smartphone could perform multiple planning functions. Thousands of planning functions. That's my whole point. But continue.
Yeah, but when you're talking about the scale of an economy, it's like more like 14 trillion equations.
Yeah, I have like some specific points on this because, like Matt said, the Soviet Union did utilize linear programming a bit, and yes, linear programming certainly has its place. Like in the case of farming, you probably have just a small handful of inputs and outputs, so it can be it is very efficient, and actually in utilizing it in the Soviet Union was very efficient, but the issue with it is it kind of discounts the rationale part, right? So in many areas they produced like mass amounts of like coats, for example, and then they just had completely unusable stuff. Like they made them in child sizes because they're like, oh, in order to meet this particular quota, we have to make things like this particular size or make things that people generally just don't like. They had an issue with ugly clothes that people just didn't like, which, I mean, there's more important things than that, obviously, but that's just an example. A great example also is like China, for example. A lot of people, they quote like how they massively increased steel production, but the issue with that is they produced mostly useless pig iron, which because they just didn't have the actual rational planning part. And the Soviet Union had this consistently. They had very poor allocative efficiency in many areas. Actually, the most productive parts of the Soviet economy were the very, very rare privately owned parts. Like 3% of agriculture was privately owned, yet accounted for 43% of vegetable production. And a lot of their greatest achievements came directly from America. Like their initial huge leap in agriculture, they started off with like 3,000 tractors in like 1920. About 10 years later, they had 150,000 tractors. Most of these came from the United States or were directly copied from U.S. tractors. Even in the war, they had very poor production in trucks when they were trying to get into Germany, and many other things. And the U.S. Incorporated Lend-Lease, and they sent over more trucks than the Soviet Union was even producing at the time. And they sent in gasoline, lots of different things. And if it wasn't for all of these supplies sent in by the U.S., then they would have probably taken another 3 years to even reach Berlin. So yeah, the Soviet Union had successes and efficiencies in some areas, but these weren't really things that we should be striving for.
I also had one more point to make in response to what Matt was saying earlier with how he thought that the 10.5 quintillion figure was ridiculous. I can send you the mathematics on it, but this actually has to do with Touchstone 3 of Englehart's paper, where he talks about the limits on processing power and how the top 500 computers in 2013, which is the 500, which should be applied with the fastest supercomputers in the world, and the processing speed of this is measured in what is called flops, right? Floating point operations per second. So the combined power of all of them as of June 2013 can perform 233 petaflops, right? And then you combine the formula for the number of floating point operations required to solve the problem with the processing speed of the top 500 computers, we can arrive on a reasonable lower limit on the processing time required to solve the computation problem that Engelhart is outlining.
Well, I would love to see that. Also, Ben, I just wanted to look up what you were saying. The Soviet Union was producing 29,000 tractors in 1933, while the U.S. was only producing 24,000. Like the USSR was outpacing the U.S. in tractor production. The idea that the U.S., who was diametrically opposed to the socialist state of the USSR, would send them, hundreds of thousands of tractors is to me ridiculous.
Oh, I can send you like a whole
I would love to see that, because
yeah,
just doing some cursory glances here, and I've done some prior research on this before, and the USSR in the 1920s and 30s, they were specifically focusing on collectivizing farms, they turned a lot of their state industry into farming at the behest of commodities, which again is one of my critiques of the Soviet Union, but they were trying to go full bore into collectivized farming. So they were producing tractors very regularly.
Yeah, they were producing more tractors like after 1930, because this was at the point that a lot of the U.S. tractors already came to the Soviet Union. Now I'm just trying to, I have this pulled up on my phone, but I'm trying to get it pulled up on my actual, here we go. So the American tractor comes to the Soviet Union is the name of, wait, oh, sorry. The American tractor comes to Soviet agriculture, the transfer of a technology. That's the title of the paper. I'll go ahead and link it in the actual,
You mind if I jump in, Matt?
link it.
Okay. I want to get back to like this comparison of like socialism versus capitalism. Like I think the basic thing that we can look at is like worker cooperatives. So I'm sure like we've all like all the Boschists in the chat are gonna go wild here, but like yeah, we've like there's worker cooperatives are businesses where like workers democratically elect a board of directors, and in some cases they all workers own a share in the company. There are about 485 to 800 cooperatives in the US. They have annual revenues of $550 million. And studies have shown that like I mentioned this in my opening statement, the risk of like dissolving is 29% lower for worker managed firms than for conventional firms. They have higher rates of profits. Rutgers study found that like they can worker cooperatives have 14% more profits than like regular firms. And also like a study in France showed that like they have higher rates of worker satisfaction, and the like productivity also increases 6 to 14%. And like we can see like when we gave workers more power within the workspace, it's like it leads to better like outcomes, better lives. And like we can argue about like whether or not like regular firms are good or not, but I think it's a really good example of how like more collective ownership, more socialism is better for the workers.
Yeah.
So we're not like inherently opposed to worker co-ops. In fact, like within capitalism, worker co-ops can be a pretty good system. One of the issues would be them going on a larger scale. We've seen this 2 times. One was in Venezuela and 2 was in Yugoslavia, or the other way around. Yugoslavia happened earlier back in like the 70s. So looking at worker co-ops within capitalist countries, there's a few different things we see, right? Sometimes we do see higher productivity, higher profits, and there's various reasons for this, right? One of the reasons is because oftentimes when you're starting a worker co-op, you're going out and seeking specific types of workers because you need people who are able to make decisions and stuff like that. And often people get a lot of like-minded people. A lot of worker co-ops in the US is mostly built up of socialistic people. So you have people who generally work well together, and this can be a great business model. But then there also can be some things that kind of throw off the data a bit, like that's not really accounted for. I don't know if you cited Bartlett 1992.
I can double check. Yeah, for which point?
On worker co-ops, you brought up like 2 different research style. There's like so many.
I think there's.
I cited like let me see. For the one about survivability, I cited. I'm opening the link right now. My bad.
I think Bartlett mostly talks about profits, but in his paper,
yeah.
So in his paper, he points out that the worker co-ops were more profitable, but then he's like, okay, but there may be other reasons for that. So he looked into other things, like how they engaged in export markets, which was significantly less. At the capitalist firms, he compared them to 40% of their profits were coming from the export market. They were a lot more engaged in export markets, which are a lot more competitive, and so less profitable. Because it drives prices down, while worker co-ops, they were 16%. And there's lots of other different things like worker co-ops do less subcontracting. Also, they engage in less risky behavior, which can be good, can be bad. That's the thing about risk. It can be a big payoff. But one of the reasons they engage in less risky behavior is generally workers have higher time preference. So, entrepreneurs and people like that generally have lower time preference. So they value profits over a period of time rather than immediately. So like higher profits over a period of time.
I think,
So that's one of the things that comes into risk and investments. So they make a lot less long-term investments, which, if you're just looking at one particular worker co-op, then, it can be a good thing. You have a small amount of people there. You're taking care of those people. And, you're not too worried about getting bigger or being super competitive because, you're not even engaging in the most competitive markets anyways. But when you're actually trying to grow and innovate a lot more, then that becomes much more difficult if you're not taking these risks or engaging in long-term investments.
Yeah, I think Bean has more of the empirics on this. But I just wanted to emphasize some of his points concerning just the entrepreneurial functions and capital accumulation and the importance of time preference, right? So, in Austrian capital theory, we have there's and this actually plays a role in the Austrian theory of the trade cycle. And the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, right? So we have entrepreneurship, right? The entrepreneurial functions of the market, right? And unless you're going to take a Lachmanian approach, or your post-Keynesian, I don't know, whatever, and reject the general tendency towards equilibrium in the market economy, I would take the Kersnerian position, right? The Kersnerian theory of entrepreneurship, which you can find in his book Competition and Entrepreneurship. He basically talks about how entrepreneurship is crucial to the maintenance of not the maintenance of equilibrium, but the tendency towards equilibrium, right? Since we're always in a state of disequilibrium, right? Resources aren't allocated perfectly, right? They aren't. This cannot be the case, right? The evenly rotating economy, right, is simply a tool of analysis in order for us to understand the workings of the economy, right? It's not something for us to say, no, this is something that's going to be achieved. Obviously not, right? But when we're talking about entrepreneurship, right, and us actually getting into a better allocation of resources, right, we want to better. I don't know if better is the right term, but you know what I mean, right? That's in the context of satisfying consumer demands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Getting us to a place in which that is the case, right? Entrepreneurship is a crucial factor, and you lack that entrepreneurial function in a worker co-op. And then with the point that Bean was talking about on time preference, right? In order for there to be investment, and I know I think Bumbover has work on this in his book. I think I'm not sure if it's Positive Theory of Capital or Capital and Interest. One of those two. He talks about Robinson Crusoe and how Robinson Crusoe has two choices, right? He can either save his capital, he can save his fish, right, and instead spend his time, a scarce resource, right, building, investing, saving, right, and in order to at the end have a larger payoff, right? That's what lower time preference people desire. Higher time preference people, right? He prefers consumption now over the future consumption, over more consumption in the future, right? The temporal aspect, right? Isn't everyone's degree of time preference isn't like a homogeneous unit.
Mm-hmm.
So we have different people of varying time preferences, and I think it would be a necessity for you to have people who are saving, people who are investing, and then having them take the entrepreneurial functions instead of leaving it up to a democratic board, right? Because as Bean was alluding to earlier, workers tend to be more high time preference, and that gets into the extraction of surplus value and the time discount on that. But that's a whole other discussion. But besides that, workers tend to be more higher time preference, and the entrepreneurs in the economy tend to be lower time preference.
I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, though. I mean, we saw with the Trump tax cuts in 2017 that instead of investing in jobs like we were promised, right? Like, oh, if you deregulate, if you cut taxes, that millions of jobs will be created. Well, we didn't really see that from the TCGA or the JA. But on top of that, over half of the companies who received tax cuts put that back into stock buybacks, basically just to boost their share price, give more money back to the shareholders, give more money back to the owners. And they were thinking of a short time preference, kind of like you're saying. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Why not invest in your workers? Why not invest in your workplaces? The thing that I see too often with capitalists in general is they're thinking for short-term profits. We see that again and again and again. We see that after 2008. We see that after almost every single recession. And again, that's one of my huge problems with capitalism in general. And you're saying that workers are more long-term. Why is that a bad thing? If we're
no, it's the opposite. It's the opposite.
Right, workers are more concerned with the present. Higher time preference means like present, like more not future, more present oriented.
I generally again. So I'm okay. So I'm saying that capitalists have lower time preference then.
I think.
There are things that can throw things off, like the Federal Reserve flooding the market with lower credit and stuff like that, and this stuff does throw off time preference. But generally, like empirically, wealthier people and people who are entrepreneurs and stuff like that are lower time preference, which means they're more concerned with long-term profit. So like a good example would be like the Stanford marshmallow experiment. You get like an 11-year-old kid, you put them in a room under observation, you put a marshmallow in front of them, and you say, you can eat this marshmallow in the 15 minutes that I'm gone out of the room. And, it's fine. But if you don't eat it and I come back in 15 minutes, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. So a higher time preference kid might be like, oh, I can't resist. I'm going to eat the marshmallow now, even though obviously it's more, at a surface level, it seems more valuable to have 2 marshmallows. And the same can be said for, money, stuff like that, at a surface level. But since individual people have their own preferences, they value having a lower amount sooner than a higher amount later. So a kid who like waits for the 2 marshmallows would have a lower. Yeah,
I have one more point to make in response to the Trump tax cuts. This isn't a defensive trickle down. The proposition isn't that they'll invest in more jobs, right? The wealth will trickle down to them, right? That's not what we're arguing. But even then, I know Franklin and Eric have some stuff concerning supply side econ. I don't know if they want to talk about that, but I just want to say that we're not defending trickle down economics. We're just saying that these people are lower time preference. They spend more time. They are more future oriented, right? That's what lower time preference essentially means. And in order for there to be growth in an economy, and I think Roger Garrison outlines this in his in the first aspect or element or whatever of his model of the ABCT with the production possibilities frontier. In that the expansion of the production possibility frontier and the growth of the economy, right, necessitates investment in the economy.
So I have a question. So I guess on kind of going along with like high time preference people who are only looking in the short term. I feel
sorry. I'm not the moderator, but I just want to say I want to give you guys like a whole 10 minutes, like your side, a whole like 10 minutes. I want to end this relatively soon, but I want you guys to have an opportunity. So like a whole 10 minutes, you guys can talk and make various points and rebuttals.
I'm good at that. I just have one more
like point. 15 minutes, we'll end it.
I just have one more point though, is the fact that like, again, it seems like capitalists are more interested in the short term. To me, they're more likely just trying to make a buck, right? They don't really care about the longer term game. And I also think that extends to other external externalities like climate change. We see that cutting regulations does not do a good thing for climate change. The Trump EPA cut regulations, and now we basically allowed corporations and companies to pollute the waters. I don't understand how you guys think that cutting regulations will actually make corporations and companies better, right? So I used to work in construction, and every single person would try to cut corners to make a buck. Okay, so we had certain regulations that we had to uphold. You couldn't put an electric box by a water line for a certain amount of feet because we didn't want the water to leak and run out of electricity, whatever. And the other thing is, 100%. But the other thing is, especially under construction, you might not see like the cracks in the building, now, but 10 years from now, if you kind of cut corners, if you don't follow the regulations, buildings will fall. There could be a lot of catastrophes that are associated with cutting regulations that you don't see in the future. So if your argument would be that cutting regulations will actually improve the capitalists because they'll be competitive and they'll try to make the best products, well, you might not see the final result now, but in 10 years, these people who are cutting regulations but selling cheaper products might end up, hurting a lot of people. That's my biggest beef, again, with cutting a lot of regulations there.
Yeah, that's when we say, are we doing like you guys bring up all your points, or should I respond to that?
You can respond to that. I would love to hear what you got.
Yeah. So when we say that they're low time preference, we're taking into account the time spent saving, the time spent getting a loan, whatever, right? We're taking that into account. Then the time in which the production process takes place, and the workers are working right here in this area, right? Now they're waiting at the same time, right? Temporally, they're in the same area. And then after, whenever they get paid bi-weekly, whenever, right? After that, their uneasiness, that end has been satisfied. And then after that, right? After the I guess let's take this away from construction. I think it'd be easier to illustrate from with just a simple product, like during the production process to make an iPhone, right? Whatever it's called, the worker is getting paid off of a wage, right? They're getting paid during during the production process, right, of the iPhone, but only when the iPhone is actually sold, right, and the materials have been attained for the iPhone just before the worker even works on them, and the saving in order for them to even pay the wages of the worker, and when you take all that into account, the amount of time the person must wait, or the capitalist must wait before they turn a profit, is necessarily longer in comparison to the worker, right? We're not saying, oh, well, they don't care about the present at all, right? That's not what we're saying, right? We're saying comparatively to the worker, right, they tend to have a lower time preference.
Are we doing the thing where we list all of our we just dump all of the rebuttals and stuff we have?
Yeah, sure. We could do 5-minute closing statements right now.
Okay. Oh, I don't have a closing. I just wanted to say
yeah, no, just say your thoughts on the debate or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to say that for the entrepreneurial thing, about businesses and stuff, in a perfect socialist world, the thing is if you were a worker, you think you have a really good idea for a business, if you're Steve Jobs, you want to branch off from your McDonald's job and create an iPhone, you can do that because all of your means of subsistence will be provided for. You'll have food, clothing, water, shelter. That's all given to you. You can spend as much time on research as you want, and as long as if you eventually start a business, if it gets to a certain size, as long as you have worker ownership, you can do whatever you want. We're just saying that in any business, since the workers are the ones who are creating new value, since they are contributing to the wealth of that business, they should have a say in how it's run, how it's operate, and their wages. So that's my point. And also in Towards a New Socialism, Paul Kopchach says that you could have a state sector which puts spending on innovation and new innovations that reduce the amount of labor time to maximize efficient production. So that's my response to that. And also I just want to touch on something Ben said a while back. He said that there's an incentive for the rich to for people to work together under capitalism or under any system. And he brought up about how his about Facebook funding small businesses, about his bank calling to help him out in the pandemic. And I think you could focus on individual examples, but our main point is the general incentive structure under capitalism is the profit motive, and it separates capitalists from the individual and incentivizes them to turn a profit at the expense of their fellow man. If you look at the worst case scenario, if you look at a historical perspective, they have funded fascists. In Germany, the capitalist class put forward 20 million lire to fund Mussolini's campaign, and they also encouraged him to Mussolini brought forward right-wing mobs to beat up labor unions and movements. In Germany, the capitalist class also helped fund Hitler's presidential campaign in 1932. Also, in Germany, where we saw the rise of fascism, I'm pulling up the statistics here. The top, like the capitalist class in the 30s, while like the rest of the world was experiencing an economic dip, in Germany, the top 5% of income earners enjoyed a 15% gain in the national income. And also we saw like modest wages were cut in Germany by 25 to 40%, and in Italy by 50%. Because like these capitalist funded fascists, I think you guys are like a little bit better than fascists, but like it still brings up the points that like capitalists will do almost anything to like to maintain their profits. And I guess that's the biggest point of the debate. I got nothing else to say.
Yeah, I mean that's actually really interesting. So I got 3 books here. Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, German big business and the rise of Hitler, and then Wall Street and the rise of Hitler. And these actually go over like the exact stuff you're talking about. So actually the same thing happened with the Bolshevik Revolution. It was actually, a lot of people don't know this, it was actually funded by a couple of American millionaires. Like Trotsky, when he was living in New York, he had a limo take him around. You know, he was being backed by wealthy people. Lenin as well. You know, the German and British governments helped him get back to Russia for the revolution. So if it actually wasn't for the perceived pro-capitalist people who really weren't pro-capitalist, then the revolution would have never even happened. And so as far as like Germany goes, yes, a lot of big businesses did end up taking the side with the Nazis, but there was a couple of different reasons for this. They didn't do this until after. Like this actually goes over like the financial data and everything. They didn't start doing this until after the Nazis were already pretty much cemented. Actually, after they were already pretty popular, and they already had the intention of redistributing businesses to Nazi party members, especially from Jewish people. So it was sort of the privatization. You know, people say like Nazi Germany privatized. It wasn't really privatization. It was just kind of redistributing businesses to people who were specifically in the Nazi party. And at that point, the government sort of centrally planned production and wages and stuff like that. So they went along with the authoritarian government because they saw it in their best interest. Now, I mean, I don't think people should do that at all. But I don't think that's generally a problem in a more free society. You know, that's if there comes an authoritarian government, various people are going to go to take their side because they don't want to be on the side that's being aggressed against. And I think that's something that any system will fall under. That's just more of a problem with morals than anything, I would say. But anyways. So going
to like closing
to
statements
a
now?
few different things. Yeah, I'm sort of going into like a closing statement. So generally throughout history today, not only theoretically, but empirically, we've seen that more private property rights, more freedom for people has resulted in significantly better circumstances. We saw Chile switch around from going into economic ruin, even under an authoritarian dictator. They had many issues. There was times when he abandoned their own free market reforms, but generally we saw the free market reforms switch things around. We saw Sri Lanka. They spent years as a socialist country, and then they switched around. It drastically improved equality, poverty. Peru, when they switched to a more free market, drastically decreased inequality, poverty. It's just a very consistent thing that we see. Joshua Hall and Robert Lawson, the two economists, they did a whole research paper. They went over 400 studies on economic freedom and various effects on different measures of quality of life. Over 2/3 of these showed that it was generally good outcomes, while less than 4% showed bad outcomes. Just overwhelmingly, we see that giving people freedom, respecting people's property rights, benefits things. When it comes to environmentalism, that as well, there's a direct correlation with countries that respect property rights more and better environmental quality, especially with air pollution. Not only that, but we see more innovation under capitalism. We saw the introduction of the what was it called? The flash furnace, the flash smelter, which drastically decreased sulfur emissions and was much more efficient. We've seen lots of different innovations like that came from capitalists and drastically improved our environment. If it wasn't for these types of inventions, things would be much worse today. Even looking at the Soviet Union, they had the worst pollution ever in the history of man. The fall of the Soviet Union was the biggest reversal of pollution in the history of mankind. And we've consistently seen that left-wing countries have handled these situations worse. The only real way to handle conservation is by conserving property rights. And yeah, I guess I'll close there. I don't know if Spec wants to say a few things.
If the socials have anything to, I'm just preparing some.
Well, I was just gonna say, I don't know. I'm kind of disappointed. I thought we'd hit more on the impacts or which system is better. I don't think that we necessarily did that. I did want to talk about the ECP. I thought that was a good discussion, but I did want to talk more about the material conditions of people under capitalism versus socialism. I don't feel like we did that. And then to go back to your point, Ben, what you just brought up about how privatization and free markets, free people. I feel like it has the opposite effect, and we see that especially in like former socialist states, like in East Germany. We see that in the GDR. We see that, even in we see a reversal of that in Cuba. But basically, my bottom line is like when you introduce markets in countries, oftentimes it has like a super negative effect. So like in the GDR, prostitution went up like a lot. Like they outlawed prostitution, but I think there were like 15,000 prostitutes in the GDR after they opened them up to markets. Same in the former socialist Eastern Europe states. Prostitution went up a lot just because women didn't have the economic opportunities that they had under socialism. In Cuba, it was the opposite. So under the fascist Batista regime, there were 150,000 prostitutes, and Cuba was essentially just a colony of the United States where sugar was just getting extracted and tobacco, and it was just basically a casino for a lot of rich people. And there were 150,000 prostitutes. Once the Castro regime came in, as much criticism as I have for them, women did have their material conditions met to a greater degree than when markets were there. And prostitution, the need for prostitution went down significantly. And so I just think you're very wrong on the fact that if you respect the free market and private property rights, that everybody's material conditions will improve. And again, I was kind of disappointed. I thought that we could have had a better discussion on, the end goal of both of our utopias. But that's all I gotta say.
All right. I think this concludes the debate right now.
I just have some final concluding remarks, I guess. So I think firstly, I'd like to touch on. I would have liked to touch more on the LTV, and I guess the predictive capacities of it. We more so talked about socialism and sort of diverted away from the Marxian analysis. I know we touched on it at the beginning with Jonathan bringing up the class contradictions, but I thought we would get to talk more about that, but unfortunately we didn't. And I agree with Matt in regards that the ECP discussion was good. I think that I don't think there was a coherent response to it though. I think that my response wasn't really contended, at least not not sufficiently. I think that outside of just the calculation problem, the open discussion era where we just had points concerning entrepreneurship, profit and loss, whether or not it was viable, equilibrium, and whether or not it was a tool of analysis, whether or not capitalists viewed it as a tool of analysis or if it was something attainable. I think those areas were really great discussion. But I do agree with you that we should have talked more about the actual viability of our systems and just assuming away the pragmatic aspects of it. That's all.
Yeah, capitalism bad, socialism good. That's all I got.
I'm rejecting the law of identity right now.
Right, so I guess we'll go ahead and sort of wrap this up. I really appreciate Matt and John coming on.
Thank you guys.
Yeah,
this was a very good and a good conversation and very respectful. So I'm glad we didn't have any yelling matches or anything like that. You know, I agree with Matt. We definitely like pictured the debate going differently, but as long as it was good and everyone had fun, then that's great. So yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you for Eric and showing up at the very last second and being the moderator. Even though we didn't really need you because we're all super awesome and friendly.
Facts.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the stream. Once again, thank you everyone for watching, and we are out. Wait, we are